the night my daughter stopped using her voice. The message came through at 11:42 on a Wednesday evening while I was sitting in my sunroom reading a biography of Harriet Tubman and drinking chamomile tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. 4 words. That was all. Cedar tree, front porch. I set the book face down on the arm of my chair. My reading glasses stayed on my nose for exactly 3 seconds before I removed them carefully and placed them on the side table beside the cold tea. Outside, the November wind pressed steadily against the windows overlooking my small backyard. My neighbor's wind chimes rang softly somewhere beyond the fence. I sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then I stood, walked to my bedroom closet, and put on my shoes. Cedar tree, front porch. My daughter Grace had invented that phrase herself when she was 14 years old, 2 years after her father walked out and I had returned from my second overseas contract with the State Department, carrying a locked briefcase and a particular kind of exhaustion that takes years to fully understand. Grace had watched me come home changed, more careful, more observant, better at reading rooms. She had sat beside me one evening at the kitchen table and asked, with the directness of children who haven't yet learned to soften hard questions, what would happen if she was ever in trouble and couldn't explain it safely? So we made a code. Cedar tree meant come now. Front porch meant come alone. She was 31 years old. She hadn't used it once in 17 years. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. Voicemail after 2 rings. I dialed again. Same result. My chest tightened in a way that reminded me of certain rooms in certain countries where I had learned that silence after a signal was not reassurance. I called my former colleague, Patricia Graves, next. Patricia had spent 22 years as a federal investigator before retiring to a quiet house 12 minutes from mine, with 2 cats and a garden that she maintained with the same disciplined attention she had once applied to surveillance operations. She picked up on the first ring. "Gracie used the code," I said. A pause. Then, "I'll be in my car in 4 minutes." That was Patricia. I grabbed my keys, my coat, my phone charger, and the small emergency kit I kept in the front hallway closet out of a professional habit that had never fully converted into a domestic one. Bet, my 14-year-old beagle, lifted her head from the rug near the front door and regarded me with the wisdom of an elderly dog who understood emergencies without needing explanations. "Stay," I told her. She lowered her head again immediately. The drive to Grace's neighborhood took 19 minutes in light traffic. I made it in 14. Patricia's silver Subaru was already parked beneath a street lamp a half block down when I arrived. She climbed into my passenger seat wearing her old investigation jacket and the expression she reserved for situations that had already gone past the point of gentle resolution. "How long since the message?" she asked. 22 minutes. She nodded once. Through the windshield, Grace's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, looking exactly as it always looked from the outside. Brick exterior, carefully maintained landscaping, warm light through the front windows. The kind of house that appeared in real estate advertisements as a family home in a desirable neighborhood. Then we heard it. A voice from inside. Male. Not shouting exactly. Something worse than shouting. The controlled, cold register of someone who had learned that particular volume was more frightening than volume. "That's Marcus," I said. Patricia was already watching the upper windows. "Living room or kitchen?" "Kitchen. Lights wrong for living room." We sat for another 30 seconds. The controlled voice rose briefly, then dropped again. Something hit a hard surface inside. Not glass breaking. Something heavy placed down with deliberate force. Then my granddaughter's voice. 8-year-old Lily. Thin and high and trying very hard to stay quiet. I opened my car door. "Wait!" Patricia said, not as a command, as a question. She was asking if I had thought this through. "Long enough," I said. I crossed the wet lawn with Patricia 2 steps behind me. The front walkway was lined with small solar lights Grace had installed herself last spring, a project she had mentioned over Sunday dinner while Marcus sat across the table looking at his phone with the particular quality of absence that I had categorized by then, but not yet named correctly. I did not knock. The front door was unlocked. It opened on a hallway that smelled of dinner and something sharper beneath it. Not alcohol exactly. The particular staleness of a house where tension had been building for longer than anyone had admitted. Grace stood near the kitchen table. She was wearing jeans and the blue cardigan she favored on weekday evenings. Her dark hair had fallen across her face, and she was holding her own elbows in the way people hold themselves when they've stopped expecting anyone else to. Her left cheek was flushed in an uneven way that told me everything before she looked up. Marcus Elledge stood on the far side of the kitchen island. He was 41 years old, 6 feet tall, a financial consultant with a collection of tailored shirts, and the kind of practiced confidence that photographs well at company events. He had been married to my daughter for 6 years. I had never trusted him in a way I could fully articulate until standing in his kitchen at 11:47 on a Wednesday night and watching him look at my arrival the way certain men look at interruptions. Margaret. His voice shifted immediately into managed warmth. This is unexpected. Lily came from around the corner of the hallway. She was wearing dinosaur pajamas and holding a worn yellow blanket against her chest with both hands. She stopped when she saw me, and for 1 second, her face did something that nearly took my knees out from under me. Relief. The specific, overwhelming relief of a child who has been waiting for rescue to arrive. "Grandma Maggie!" She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and pressed herself against my side. I put my arm around her. "Hey, sweetheart." I kept my eyes on Marcus while I said it. Patricia had moved to the edge of the kitchen doorway, neither inside nor outside the room, positioned the way experienced investigators position themselves when observing a situation still determining its own shape. Marcus noted her presence. His expression recalibrated slightly. "I don't believe we've met." "Patricia Graves," Patricia said pleasantly. "And you're here because Margaret called me." Simple, true, utterly uninformative. Marcus looked toward Grace. "You sent the text." Not a question, a verdict. Grace hadn't moved. She was still holding her own elbows. "Grace," I said carefully, "can you take Lily upstairs for a few minutes?" Marcus spoke before Grace could answer. "Nobody needs to go anywhere. This is a private family moment that's gotten slightly out of hand and now apparently requires a committee." He laughed softly, the laugh of a man who still believed humor could reframe any room he chose to stand in. I looked at Lily. "Can you show me your room later? I want to see those drawings you mentioned last week." Lily looked between me and her mother. Grace gave the smallest possible nod. Then Lily, with the painful perceptiveness of children raised in cautious houses, took her mother's hand and led her quietly toward the stairs. Marcus watched them go. I waited until the sound of footsteps reached the upper hallway. Then I turned back toward him. "How long?" I said. He tilted his head. "I'm sorry? How long has she been afraid to answer her own phone when you're in the room?" His expression shifted into something practiced and patient, the performance of a man managing an unreasonable woman. "Margaret, I understand you're concerned. You're her mother, that's natural. But what you walked into tonight is a private disagreement between spouses that has been escalating because your daughter has been under significant emotional stress." "Is that what the mark on her cheek is from?" I said. "Emotional stress." She bumped into the cabinet door. Immediate, smooth. I looked at the cabinet in question. Then I looked at the height of the mark on Grace's face. Then I looked at Marcus again. He held my gaze for approximately 4 seconds before looking away. That told me enough. "I spent 30 years working for the State Department in various capacities," I said. Significant portions of that time were dedicated to interviewing people about events they were constructing alternative versions of. "I am quite good at knowing when a room contains a lie." Marcus set his jaw. "This conversation is over." "You're correct," I said. "This version of it is." Patricia had already stepped outside to make a call. I heard her voice low and calm through the front window. She was talking to someone she knew at the local precinct. Not dramatically, just informatively. That was also Patricia. The police arrived 17 minutes later. 2 officers, one who had clearly responded to domestic calls before and moved through the house with practiced efficiency, and one younger who kept his face carefully neutral in the way newer officers maintain composure during situations that affect them. Grace came downstairs for the second time that night, looking like someone who had been underwater and was deciding whether the surface was safe to approach. Lily stayed upstairs. Patricia sat with her up there, and I would later learn that they had spent 45 minutes looking at Lily's drawings together, while Patricia quietly asked the kinds of gentle, open-ended questions that frightened children could answer without feeling interrogated. The officers separated everyone as protocol required. I stood near the front window while one officer spoke with Marcus in the living room. Through the archway, I could see Marcus performing his most reasonable version of himself, hands open, voice measured, the practiced portrait of a man caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. In the kitchen, the female officer sat across from Grace at the table and spoke quietly. Grace answered in monosyllables at first, then slightly longer fragments. Then, slowly, whole sentences. I did not listen deliberately, but I heard enough. 3 years. Not the beginning of the marriage, the middle. The part where certainty had calcified and exits felt more complicated than they actually were. The officer did not rush. She was patient in the way that suggests not everyone in her position would have been. She asked the same core question twice in different framings, and the second time Grace answered it clearly. After the officers had documented what they needed, and Marcus had been given firm instructions about separation for the evening, I watched him leave. He carried himself with the performance of a man who believed the situation was still manageable. That belief was the most dangerous thing about him, and it was also, I understood then, already beginning to cost him. Grace came to me afterward while Lily was still upstairs with Patricia. She stood in the kitchen doorway looking the way I remembered her looking after a difficult exam in high school. Exhausted from something she hadn't told me she was carrying. I didn't know how to say it, she said. You found a way. She pressed her lips together. 4 words isn't saying it. 4 words was enough to get me here. She looked at the kitchen tile for a moment. Then she said, I've been making excuses for 2 years. I know. You knew before tonight? I thought about the Sunday dinners where Grace laughed too quickly after Marcus corrected something, about the birthday dinner where she disappeared twice to the bathroom and came back both times with slightly red eyes she attributed to allergies in October, about the day she called to cancel our monthly lunch and the sound in her voice that I had chosen to categorize as tiredness rather than fear. I knew something, I said carefully. I didn't know what, or I wasn't ready to press hard enough to find out. Grace leaned against the doorframe. He told me you were controlling, that I called you too much, that healthy adults don't need their mothers to rescue them from normal marriage stress. That was very precisely designed, I thought. Isolate the person, reframe the relationship as unhealthy, make reaching out feel like proof of inadequacy. He was wrong, I said. I know that now. She paused. I knew it then, too. But knowing something and believing it are different when someone spends enough time telling you the opposite. We left the house just after 1 in the morning. Grace and Lily came with me. Not permanently that night, both of us pretending there was still uncertainty about whether the situation required permanent action, while understanding privately that there was not. Some decisions get made before they get spoken. Lily fell asleep in my guest room, still holding the yellow blanket. Grace sat at my kitchen table with untouched tea, while the clock above the stove moved toward 3. She asked me, eventually, the question I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Why didn't you push harder before? I sat with the question for a moment before answering. Because you seemed to be managing, and because I told myself that managing meant handling. They're not the same thing. No, I said, they're not. She looked at the table. He's been borrowing against my retirement account for 14 months. I found the documents last week. He told me it was a short-term portfolio adjustment. I kept my expression neutral. How much? She told me. I stood up and walked to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists for approximately 20 seconds because my hands had gone hot and I didn't want to say anything in the first moments after hearing that number that I would need to walk back later. Grace watched me. He told me the market was volatile, that he was protecting us. He was protecting himself, I said. I kept thinking I must have misunderstood the documents. You understood them perfectly. She was quiet again. Then, he called me paranoid for questioning it. I turned off the tap and dried my hands. That's a standard response from someone who needs you to stop asking. Patricia came by at 9 the next morning with 2 coffees, a legal pad, and the contact information for a family law attorney named Carol Huang, who had spent 20 years protecting women from men who understood financial systems better than their spouses did. Patricia had worked with Carol on 3 separate cases during her investigative career and described her with characteristic economy as someone who did not lose. Carol arrived that afternoon. She was 53, small, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a briefcase that looked ordinary from the outside. She reviewed Grace's documents for 40 minutes before closing her laptop with a quiet click that somehow communicated volumes. This is financial abuse, she said simply, documented and recoverable. Grace sat very still. Recoverable. The funds haven't been fully liquidated. The trail is clear. And the pattern of documentation you have, combined with the police report from last night, creates a foundation that is frankly more complete than most clients bring me. I've been keeping records, Grace admitted. I didn't know why exactly. I just felt like I should. Carol looked at her over her reading glasses. That was very good instinct. Something shifted in Grace's face when Carol said that. Small but real. The expression of someone who has spent years being told their instincts were wrong and has just been given permission to trust them again. Over the following weeks, the practical architecture of Grace's life began to separate from Marcus's with the careful precision that legal processes required, and that Carol navigated with the competence of someone who had made this particular journey many times before. Marcus's initial response was what I expected. Apology texts in the mornings, accusation texts by afternoon, appeals to Grace's love for Lily in the evenings. The emotional rotation of a man who had always controlled situations through careful management of other people's feelings and was discovering that the tool had stopped working. He showed up at my house once. I had anticipated this. He parked his car at the curb on a Sunday afternoon and walked up my front path wearing a gray fleece jacket and carrying what appeared to be a potted plant. The plant was an interesting choice. I suspected Patricia would have appreciated the analysis of it as a prop selected for approachability. I opened the front door before he reached the porch. "She's not here," I said. He stopped, looked at the plant briefly as though reconsidering it, then set it on my porch railing with the careful movements of a man demonstrating reasonableness. "I just want to talk," he said. "Not to Grace necessarily, just, I want you to understand my perspective." "I understand your perspective, Marcus." He looked slightly surprised. "Then you know this has been blown far past what it deserves." "No," I said. "I know that's what you believe, that's different." He exhaled slowly, the practiced patience of a man who had learned that slow breathing projected calm, and calm projected reasonableness. "Margaret, you've never liked me." "That's not accurate. I liked who I understood you to be. The person I was watching in that kitchen Wednesday night was someone I didn't recognize. Things escalate. Marriages are hard." "Marriages are hard," I agreed. "Bruises are specific." His composure fractured slightly, just at the edges. "She walked into a cabinet door." "You said that before," I said. "It's still not true." He looked at me for a long moment. Then something changed in his face. Not remorse exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had finally encountered someone he could not reframe into a less complicated shape. "What do you want?" he said. "I want my daughter to be safe," I said. "I want my granddaughter to sleep without listening for footsteps. I want those two things. Everything else is between you and your attorney." He picked up the plant on his way back to the car. I watched him drive away, then went inside and called Carol. The professional consequences for Marcus arrived through channels he had not anticipated. A former colleague of Patricia's, now working with a financial regulatory body, received documentation of certain patterns in Marcus's client management that warranted a review. Not orchestrated dramatically, simply passed along through appropriate contacts with appropriate notes. Real accountability rarely announces itself. It moves through correct channels with correct paperwork and correct timing. Marcus's firm placed him on administrative leave 6 weeks after the night I walked through Grace's front door. The investigation that followed was not about Grace. It was about 3 other clients who had experienced similar quiet erosions in their account values over similar timeframes. Patterns, once examined, tended to explain each other. Carol handled the divorce proceedings with exactly the efficiency she had promised. The retirement funds were traced, partially recovered, and redirected into Grace's control. The custody arrangement was structured around Lily's needs in ways that gave Grace primary stability and gave Marcus supervised access during a period of demonstrated behavioral compliance. Grace did not celebrate any of this. She received each legal development with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that I came to understand was her processing the reality that her marriage had been something other than what she believed for longer than she had yet been able to name precisely. "I keep thinking about the first year," she told me one evening in February. We were sitting at my kitchen table with actual hot tea this time, Bet asleep on the floor between us, rain quiet against the windows. When things were good, or what felt like good. What about it? Was any of it real? I thought about that carefully before answering. I think the early version of Marcus was closer to the person he wanted to be. I think somewhere in there he made choices about how to get what he wanted, and I think those choices accumulated into someone your father wouldn't have let in the front door. Grace smiled faintly at the mention of her father. He hated the way Marcus talked over people at dinner. He mentioned that to me, I said. I had not told Grace this before. She looked up. When? 2 Christmases ago. I paused. I told him it was just Marcus's personality. Grace held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at her tea. We both looked away. Yes, I said, we did. That conversation was the most honest we had managed in years, possibly ever. And we sat inside it for a while without trying to make it more comfortable than it actually was. Sometimes honesty between people who love each other requires sitting inside the uncomfortable parts, rather than reaching immediately for reassurance. By March, Grace had moved into a rented house 12 minutes from mine. Small, yellow-shuttered, with a backyard that Lily had immediately identified as the future site of a garden that would specialize in flowers with difficult names. The Saturday they moved in, Patricia and I carried boxes while Lily supervised with the authority of someone who had spent several weeks planning the precise location of every item she owned. Carol stopped by with a housewarming plant, an actual plant this time, that Lily named Gerald without explanation. That evening, after Patricia and Carol had gone home, Grace and I sat on the back step of the yellow house with grocery store sandwiches, watching Lily arrange small garden stakes in the empty flower bed with absolute seriousness. She's going to be okay, Grace said. Yes, I said, she is. Am I going to be okay? I looked at my daughter, 31 years old, sitting on the step of her own house with paint on her wrist from helping Lily mark out the garden lines. Tired in the ordinary way of someone who had done something difficult and was now beginning to understand that difficult and permanent were not the same thing. You already are, I said. You just haven't caught up to yourself yet. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. Lily drove another stake into the dirt, announced Gerald would be planted on Saturday, and asked whether tulips or lilies were more emotionally mature. I said I honestly wasn't sure. She accepted this with some skepticism. The last time I heard from Marcus directly was a voicemail in early April. Blocked number, but the voice unmistakable. He sounded tired in the way that polish sounds when it has been worn away by enough real consequence. Not broken. Just reduced to something closer to honest. He said he understood that Grace wouldn't take his calls. He said he wanted Lily to know that he loved her even if he couldn't show it correctly right now. He said he knew he had caused damage he didn't fully understand yet. He said he was working with a therapist, which I neither confirmed nor denied to myself as meaningful information. He said at the end, quietly, "Tell Margaret I understand now why she didn't trust me." I didn't pass the message along. Some things are said for the saying rather than the receiving, and that felt like one of them. What I did was walk into the kitchen where Grace was helping Lily with a school project about ocean ecosystems and sit down across from them with a cup of coffee and watch my daughter explain the function of kelp forests with the patient cheerfulness of someone who had remembered she was good at explaining things. Lily listened with the specific, focused expression she wore when something interested her, then asked 14 follow-up questions in sequence without stopping for answers, which was her standard approach to learning and also to life generally. Grace caught my eye across the table at some point and smiled. Not a performed smile, not the kind I had watched her produce at dinner parties when Marcus was correcting something. Just a real smile from a real woman sitting at her own table in her own house, explaining kelp to her daughter on a Tuesday evening. I thought about a question Lily had asked me some months before, whether I had been a hero. I had told her heroes were just people who showed up. That answer felt more true to me now than it did when I first said it. Not because showing up required nothing, it did. It required arriving before you fully understood what you were arriving into. It required sitting with your own failures in the same room as someone else's recovery. It required accepting that presence was not the same as protection, and that the gap between those two things was where love either deepened or stayed politely shallow. I had missed signs for 2 years because asking the harder question felt intrusive into my adult daughter's private life. That was the comfortable version of my failure. The honest version was that I saw edges of something I didn't want to see clearly and chose the interpretation that allowed everyone to stay comfortable, including me. The code word existed because Grace had understood at 14 that sometimes fear has no comfortable voice. It took her 17 more years to use it. I try not to wonder what those years might have held for her if I had asked the harder questions sooner. That path leads to guilt that serves no one. What I do instead is stay close. Ask the questions that politeness used to prevent. Notice the small things, the quality of a laugh, the steadiness of hands, whether someone looks at you directly when they say they're fine. On a Friday evening in late May, I sat on my back porch watching the last of the sunset move across the horizon beyond the neighbors' roof lines. Bet slept in a wedge of warm light near the door. My book was open on my knee, but I wasn't reading it. The wind chimes rang softly. My phone lit up on the arm of my chair. A message from Grace. Cedar tree, front porch. My stomach dropped. My hand moved toward my keys. Then the next message arrived. Sorry, wrong thread. Practicing Lily's new phone. She thinks she invented a secret language. She's extremely proud. Then a photo of Lily, 8 years old, holding an old phone with both hands and grinning with the absolute confidence of someone who believed she had just made a significant contribution to human communication. I sat back in my chair. Then I laughed. Quietly, by myself, on my back porch in the early evening, with my old dog asleep in the last warm light of the day. Real laughter. The kind that arrives after something has finally been allowed to become a memory rather than a wound. I typed back, "Tell her the system is very impressive, also terrifying, in a good way." Grace replied with 3 laughing emojis and a photo of Lily's dramatic eye roll in response. I set my phone down and picked up my book. Outside, the wind chimes rang. The evening settled quietly around me. And somewhere 12 minutes away, in a yellow-shuttered house with a garden called Gerald and a flower bed full of stakes marking the future positions of difficult flowers, my daughter and my granddaughter were having an ordinary night. Which was, I had come to understand, the most extraordinary thing I had ever helped build. If someone you love has gone quiet in ways that don't feel like peace, ask the question anyway. Show up before you fully understand why. The hardest part of love is not the dramatic moments. It's learning to notice the small ones before they become emergencies. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe because the next story will find you when you need it.